All the Young Dudes, Sirius's Perspective by Rollercosterwords. Chapter 69. 4th Year, April. Sunday the 26th of April, 1975. They were beginning to win Madame Pomfrey over, Sirius was sure. The school nurse refrained from brandishing her wand and chasing them out when they arrived at the hospital wing, and she didn't even tut disapprovingly or level them with one of her trademark glares. Instead, she only sighed and glanced at the clock. "Oh, go on then," she waved them in, shaking her head. The marauders hurried past the door before she could change her mind. "Remus Lupin, you put that book down at once," she barked, marching over to the only bed in the room that was currently screened. There was the incriminating thwump of a heavy book falling suddenly onto the bed covers. "Can you see through the screens?" Remus's startled voice came from behind the thin barriers. "No," the nurse replied with an amused smile. "I just know you too well." She bustled around the pale green hospital screens, and the three boys hung back, a few steps behind her. It was a bit disconcerting, watching the two of them interact, or rather hearing. It almost reminded Sirius of the way that Effie would scold James, smiling, eyes twinkling, face softening whenever she looked at him. "I had hoped you'd be resting your eyes, not straining them," Madame Pomfrey's exasperated voice came from behind the barriers. "I can see in the dark." "No excuse." "As you're up, I suppose you're ready for visitors?" "Yeah, of course." Rustling noises as Remus moved around. Sirius grinned. Madame Pomfrey's head popped around the screen. "Come on then," she called, waving them over. And the boys filed past one by one. "Not too much noise. And no books." "Why can't you have books?" James asked, amused, leaning on the end of the bed frame. "Because it's Moony," Sirius answered, flopping down onto the small bed, so that he was lying across Remus's legs. "He doesn't understand moderation." "I just want to revise," Remus protested, looking a bit embarrassed. "I mean, I'm at school, ain't I? Isn't that what I'm supposed to do?" He nodded to Peter, who was passing out chocolate frogs. "You don't want to burn out, though," Sirius said around a bite of chocolate. "You're miles ahead of the rest of class, and exams aren't for ages." Remus's knee was poking into his back. "They're 2 weeks away," James shot back, raising a brow. "You could do with being a bit better prepared, Black." "Oh, I am sorry," Sirius rolled his eyes, shifting around to try and get more comfortable. "I forgot you'd joined the SWAT club too." "One afternoon in the library does not make me a SWAT," James grumbled, looking quite offended by the accusation. "Don't listen to him, James," Remus said, moving his leg slightly under the covers. Now his knee was poking into Sirius's stomach. "I'm proud of you. And thanks for the frogs, Pete." "Oh, they're not from me," Peter said in the armchair beside the table, where he was getting comfortable. "Desi says she hopes you get well soon." Immediately the other 3 boys snapped their heads around. "Desi?" Sirius repeated, sitting up. "You mean Desdemona?" Yeah?" Peter, who had been in the middle of chewing on a bite of chocolate, paused, staring back at them anxiously. "She asked me why I couldn't see her today, so I told her I was seeing Moony." Sirius gasped, appalled, anger licking up his spine. Why was Pettigrew so bloody stupid? "What?" Peter asked defensively. "I didn't say anything about why he was sick. I just said, 'You idiot,'" Sirius fumed, hopping down from the bed. "Sirius," Remus hissed sharply, darting a nervous glance towards the screens. "It's fine, really." "It's not fine," Sirius insisted, glaring down at Peter. "You can't go around telling everyone Remus is in the hospital wing. Not everyone is as slow on the uptake as you. Doesn't the word secret mean anything to you?" "You know it does," Peter frowned, face going pink. "I've kept all sorts of—" He broke off, glancing at Remus. Merlin, he was like a sieve for sensitive information. Might as well walk around holding a sign saying, "We're keeping secrets from you, Remus." Sirius was livid. "Anyway, Desi's not everyone. She's my girlfriend." "So what?" Sirius demanded. "You're going to tell every tart that lets you stick your slimy tongue down her throat?" There was a savage twist of satisfaction as the words hit home, and Peter's eyes grew shiny with tears, which he tried to glare around. He rubbed at his nose, sniffling, and stood abruptly. "Just because I've got a girlfriend? Just because some of us actually like spending time with girls?" Sirius went cold with rage. Icy fingers crawled down his back, twisting into his gut. He could have punched Peter. He wanted to, badly. He wanted to blacken his eye, to split his lip, to see his nose bleed. "What are you trying to say, Pettigrew?" "That I'd rather be with Desi than you lot right now. Sorry, Remus." Peter apologised quickly, before storming off with his shoulders thrown back and his chin jutting petulantly out. Sirius felt sick. What the fuck? What was Peter playing at, accusing him of not turning into a slobbery sop for the first bird who paid him any attention, not ditching his friends to go paw pathetically at some girl in a broom cupboard, not wanting to hang out with groups of giggling, simpering bints who didn't even care about Quidditch or pranks or anything that was actually interesting. Some of us actually like spending time with girls. "Moody pair of buggers, eh?" James said to Remus, trying to dispel the tension that had filled the space. "Anyway, how are you feeling? Moon go okay?" Yeah. No scars," Remus responded after a moment. Sirius could feel the boy looking at him. "Nothing broken, either. Maybe I'm finally getting good at being a werewolf." Remus liked spending time with girls. What did he mean? Sirius interrupted, turning to James. The boy shrugged. "I don't know, mate. Don't listen to him. He gave as good as he got. You're just miffed because he finally stuck up for himself." "He meant something," Sirius muttered, unsatisfied with this answer. Clearly, Peter thought that it was strange that he wasn't spending more time around girls, because apparently that was normal. Apparently he was supposed to. Apparently it was worth mentioning, even though Sirius already had half the girls in the school falling over themselves just to snog him, and Peter only had one, so really he didn't have any room to talk. Did James think he was weird? Did Mooney? "How's Quidditch going?" Remus asked, trying to change the subject. "Ready for the final?" James's eyes lit up, and he immediately launched into a detailed rundown of his big plan for the upcoming Ravenclaw game. The rematch with Slytherin had taken place in March, and, to the surprise of the entire student body, Regulus had resumed his role as Seeker. Sirius's stomach had dropped when he saw his brother walk onto the field. He'd never known Reggie to defy their parents, especially not in such an open and risky manner. All it would take was one Slytherin with loose lips, and his brother's image as the perfect son would be ruined. Sirius hadn't realised that Quidditch was so important to him. He was beginning to wonder if he knew Reg very well at all anymore. All in all, it hadn't been Sirius's best game. He tried very hard to focus, but he kept getting distracted, hesitating before hitting the bludgers, scanning the field for a head of dark curls just to check, just to make sure. It was still so vivid, the memory of his brother's body plummeting to the earth. Sirius half wished that he'd listened to their mother and kept off of his broom. Luckily, everyone else was in top form, and Gryffindor managed to win with a narrow 5-point lead. Sirius was incredibly grateful for his teammates' excellent flying. He didn't know what he'd have done if Regulus got to lord a Slytherin Quidditch victory over him for the second year in a row. As it was, his brother wasn't speaking to him. Once he got back to Hogwarts, he never mentioned the letter, only carried on ignoring Sirius as usual. Which was good. Everything was back to normal. "He gets worse every year," Sirius said quietly, knees curled into his chest on James's bed. They'd cast a silencing spell, but it was still better to be safe than sorry. He didn't want the others overhearing when he talked about his family. "I don't know what Mum's doing to brainwash him. If it weren't for our parents," James shook his head. "You've got the same parents, haven't you? You aren't running around picking on Muggle-born students in your spare time." Sirius shrugged. "But I've got you," he wanted to say. He didn't like to think about what might have happened if he hadn't met James Potter on the Hogwarts Express all those years ago. Watching Regulus grow older was like looking into a mirror sometimes, and seeing all the things he might have been. They had the same stubborn streak, the same pride. Still, unlike James, Sirius couldn't bring himself to believe that malice came naturally to Reggie. He had so many memories of this weepy little brother, crying when he was confronted with the world's injustice. Sirius had always been the hot-headed one, anger built in, with a mean streak that flared up whenever something made him mad. Even though Reg was no longer the cry-baby their mother had hated, there was still no heat about him. Everything he did was cold, cunning, carefully calculated, so that Sirius never had any idea what his brother was truly thinking anymore. He supposed it didn't matter. He would have plenty of time to try and figure out Regulus over the summer. Sirius had received a letter that morning. the first one his parents had sent to him all year, informing him that he was expected home. It was time to learn his family duty, according to his father's spiky handwriting. Normally, that sort of vague, ominous mandate might have wound him up with nerves, but as he stared down at the creamy parchment, mid-April sunshine carefully illuminating the words where it shone on the ceiling of the great hall, Sirius found that he was too tired to really care. He was beginning to feel that no matter what he did, he would always end up in the same place when it came to his family. They would bring him home and tell him to stop doing what he was doing, and he would keep doing it, and everyone would go on being unhappy in the end. In fact, he'd been feeling the creepy drag of hopelessness ever since his mother's visit to the hospital wing. No matter how much older he got, no matter how many spells he learned, no matter what amount of confidence he built up while at Hogwarts, his mother would still reduce him to a petulant, frightened child. What was the point in even trying to kid himself? He was no braver than he'd been at 11 years old. In fact, he was even more of a coward now, because without even realizing it, he'd started at some point to count on his younger brother as a shield. Whenever he thought back on the moment of that bludger hitting Reggie, remembering the thoughts that had flooded his mind, Sirius was filled with shame. Pathetic. He did his best not to succumb to these dark thoughts. James helped. They stayed up talking most nights, sometimes about his family, sometimes about the war, and sometimes about nothing at all. Having his friend was like having a fire in the winter, a bright point of light that helped stave off the darkness when it threatened to overwhelm. But James wouldn't be there during the summer, and it was hard not to feel exhausted when Sirius thought about weathering his family by himself. Now, in the hospital wing, both of his friends had fallen silent. James seemed to have run out of things to say about Ravenclaw, or perhaps he'd just noticed that Remus was no longer paying attention. Sirius tried to keep busy by transfiguring various items around the bed, but he kept thinking about Peter's words. Some of us actually like spending time with girls. Sorry, Remus said. It's a bit boring for you two in here. You don't have to stay. Remus certainly spent plenty of time with girls. It seemed like he was always holed up in the library studying with Lily, Mary and Marlene. Peter spent half his time with his tongue down his stupid girlfriend's throat, and James hung out with the girls on the Quidditch team. Nonsense, James shook his head. Nothing else to do around here. Ravenclaw have booked the pitch for the rest of the day, and Sirius won't come back to the library with me, so... James had turned into a swot ever since McGonagall told him he'd need to get his grades up if he wanted a shot at being a Quidditch captain. Sirius had suspected that it was just a way to keep the Marauders in line during exam season. Who else would be captain once Harpreet left? But James took the warning to heart, and had started spending long hours in the library. Sirius hated it. Exams were the best time to pull pranks, when everyone was losing their minds revising. But apparently, this was just one more way that he was now out of step with his friends. You can quiz me if you want, Remus said, perking up at the mention of studying. Ask me stuff about potions. Then I'll do whichever subject you want. History, James said immediately. I'm crap at history. Neither of his friends needed to study. Their grades were fine. Sirius felt irritated, scratchy and hot. Why couldn't they all just have fun like they used to? Why did everyone suddenly have to become obsessed with grades? And girls? Ugh, well if you're going to do that, I'll go, Sirius grumbled, standing up. I'm crap at all of it. No, you're not. Don't be stupid. Nah, I'm off, he interrupted Remus before he could finish. Maybe I'll go and find some girls to hang around with, since that's so important to everyone. Since when has stuff that Peter says bothered you? Remus demanded, but Sirius didn't answer, only feeling more irritated by the question. He stomped off, not bothering to glance back. Chapter 70. 4th Year, Partings. Thursday, the 29th of May, 1975. Exams were a DOS, they always were. Well, except for potions. But Sirius didn't give a toss about potions, and he hadn't for the past 4 years. He wasn't about to start. He planned to drop the class as soon as owls were over with, and it wasn't like his parents would act any different if he got good marks, so what's the point in worrying over it? The divination final did not include overmancy, much to Sirius's dismay. It had ended up being his favourite subject, but it was a partner exam focused largely on palmistry. Their shriveled professor called each pair into the office one by one, where she sat and watched as they attempted to read out each other's futures in their hands. It wasn't very difficult. Sirius had gotten quite good at wording statements that were just vague enough to sound like he was saying something important, when really he wasn't saying anything at all. And once he'd memorized the lines and the planes from the text, it was just a matter of putting two together. Still, it was vaguely intimidating, sitting across from their professor in her dark, cramped office. None of the students had ever been in there before, and Sirius understood why. The place was a complete tip, crammed with mildewed books and various odds and ends, empty teacups with leaves dried into the bottom, small, oddly shaped crystals, strange masks and stones with runes scratched into them. She draped shawls over the windows so that the sunlight weakened and came in tinged with pink and orange. There was incense burning somewhere, filling the room with a sticky sweet smoke that made Sirius feel a bit dizzy. He squinted down at James's palm, trying to see in the dim light. Their professor sat, blinking placidly, almost inhumanely still. Let's see. Long headline, indicating a broad range of intellectual pursuits, but it isn't particularly deep, so you might not spend much time on any of them. Deep heart line, beginning below the index finger. Relationships will be a very important part of your life. Then, and you'll draw a lot of happiness from those close to you. Long lifeline, which also indicates that the people you encounter will have an important impact on your life. And it's fairly deep. So, a rich life, influenced heavily by others. He let go of James's palm, looking up at the professor to indicate that he was done. Fate line? She croaked, in her tremulous, warbly voice. Oh, right. Sirius snatched his friend's hand back. It's sort of faint. Lots of breaks. So, you'll be encountering significant changes soon. He glanced back at their professor again, hoping it would be enough to satisfy her. She hummed, stretching out her gnarled hand. After a moment, James realized what she wanted, and placed his palm on top of hers. She dragged him closer, squinting as she studied the lines that Sirius had just attempted to analyze. She murmured, poking and prodding at James's palm, tracing the lines with her fingers. She frowned, glanced up at him, then looked back, still frowning. After a moment, the old witch sighed, patting James gently before she released it. She didn't say anything about what she found, though, only waited expectantly for the pair to repeat the entire process, but with Sirius's palm. In the end, they both got acceptables, which was perfectly satisfactory. Sirius had no intentions of becoming any sort of seer or fortune-teller. In fact, he preferred to think about the future as little as possible, especially with the summer coming up. The outlook was bleak. It would be the first time in over a year that all four marauders would be separated. Sirius's family had already forbidden him from visiting the Potters, and Remus would be stuck in the Muggle world. Even Peter would be absent. His family was going to America to try and visit Philomena. James had argued vigorously on Sirius's behalf, even written to Dumbledore to try and convince him that Sirius should be allowed to stay with the Potters. But it wasn't as if the headmaster could do anything. It was his parents they were talking about, and they had every right to lock Sirius up at home if they wanted to. I'll have Reg, he'd reassured his friends, resigned to his fate. Maybe if he's not surrounded by Slytherins all the time, he'll listen to a bit of reason. He's old enough now. His friends still seemed concerned. Remus promised over and over again to write, and Mary even offered to try and visit when she heard that he would be in London, which was nice, he supposed, but never going to happen. His mother would lose her mind if a Muggle-born tried to set foot in her house. James had an entire escape plan in place, which made Sirius feel a bit odd. He knew it was just because his friend cared, but he had already survived 15 years with his family, and though things were quite tense with the war and the meetings and the politics, at the end of the day it was just another summer. He'd be fine, and he certainly didn't want anyone's pity. Besides, he'd have plenty to do to keep him busy. Despite being separated, he, James, and Peter were determined to finally brew their respective animagi potions. The first step was holding a mandrake leaf in their mouths for 30 days, and they'd already been practicing with the leaves from the greenhouse to try and figure out how to best hold the plant, while they were still able to eat and talk, and generally not let others catch on to the fact they had a leaf in their mouth. Peter had swallowed his accidentally a few times, but all three of them had managed to get it down well enough that Sirius was confident they'd be able to do it. It would be difficult, of course, especially for Peter, who'd be travelling with his family, and Sirius, who'd have to avoid watchful eyes of both his parents and creature. But they'd collected all the ingredients they needed, and they'd reviewed the instructions over and over until all of them could practically recite the incantation in their sleep. There was no point waiting any longer. "Oi, Evans!" James's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. Having just completed their divination exam, they were on their way back to the Gryffindor common room, and it looked as if Evans was too. She whipped her head around, curtain of red hair swinging, and rolled her eyes as she caught sight of them. "What do you want, Potter? Need help with your books?" "I'm fine, thank you very much. I can carry your bag for you. Believe it or not, I'm quite capable of carrying things myself." "Yeah, but they look a bit heavy." Sirius sighed as they fell into step beside her, resigning himself to the increasingly familiar scene of his friend acting like a prat over Lily Evans. "And?" Lily snapped, irritated. "I've got arms, haven't I?" Sirius didn't understand why she always had to be so prickly with them. She was perfectly nice to Remus. But James, as always, was undeterred. "Indeed you have," he grinned. "A perfectly good pair of arms. Excellent at, carrying books, I suppose." Lily snorted. They had arrived at the portrait door, and she didn't bother to say goodbye as she swept inside, hurrying over to the girls' dormitories. James sighed wistfully at her. Sirius shook his head, studying his friend's lovesick expression. "I'll never understand you, mate," he said as they made their way back to their own room. "Why do you even like her?" "Well, what's not to like?" James asked, sounding genuinely confused. "Mate, she treats you like shit." James laughed, and Sirius doubled down. "I'm serious. She's only ever rude to you. Name one nice thing she's said to you this entire year." "She said I was the greatest just the other day. I believe her exact words were, 'the greatest idiot who has ever graced the halls of Hogwarts.'" Was that it?" James chuckled, setting his school bag down. "She's got away with words, that Lily." Sirius stirred, exasperated. It was impossible. The boy's brain turned to mush whenever the subject of Evans came up. Still, he tried again. "Seriously, mate, why her?" He looked down, beginning to unknot his tie. Now that they'd finished their final exam, and classes were officially over, he was eager to get out of his uniform. When James didn't immediately respond, Sirius looked up. His friend was staring out of the window, looking unusually thoughtful. "What?" "Do you remember second year? Which part?" James sighed, smiling slightly. "Near the end of term. You all kept teasing me about having a crush on Evans, and I thought it was so embarrassing." He laughed. "I kept trying to deny it, and then one day at breakfast they served French toast, you know, with all the berries and icing and sugar." Sirius nodded. The house elves made a fantastic French toast, and served it with a full spread of toppings. He had no idea what any of that had to do with Evans, though. James's eyes had a glazed look as he spoke, as if he was only half present, remembering. "I looked over, and she'd got icing sugar on her nose. And, I don't know, it sounds stupid, but I felt like something just clicked, and I couldn't stop staring. And then she turned and caught me looking, and she rolled her eyes, you know, the way she does, and I just couldn't stop smiling." Sirius blinked, waiting for the punchline. "That's it." James shrugged. "That's it." There was a pause as they looked at each other, and then Sirius burst out laughing. "Merlin, Potter, you're such a girl. That's the stupidest, soppiest story I've ever heard." "Laugh all you want, Black," James stiffened, indignant. "But if you keep talking like that, I'm afraid I won't be able to invite you to the wedding." Friday the 27th of June, 1975. On the last Friday of term, with exams and lessons completed, Sirius sat down for dinner with his friends. He was looking forward to enjoying their company without having to worry about anyone running off for a last-minute cram session in the library or shoving a textbook in his face and demanding that he quiz them. Unfortunately, fate had other plans. Ugh, Sirius groaned as one of his parents' owls landed in front of him. Scroll wrapped around its leg. The bird hooted imperiously, head swivelling on its neck. "I'll do it," James said quickly, reaching over to tug the note free. The bird hooted again and flapped its wings, flying off immediately. James shoved his glasses up his nose as he read. They had a tendency to slip down when he bent his head. After a moment, he shrugged and scrunched the note up, tossing it over his shoulder. "Just making sure you know you have to meet them at King's Cross. They're expecting you and Regulus to be together." "Worried I'll pull a disappearing act," Sirius said, smirking for a moment as he imagined how satisfying it would be to see his parents' faces if he just didn't show up. Will you?" Sirius asked nervously. Sirius sighed, discarding the fantasy. "Not worth it," he said. "Bet they'll be there early just to spite me, and I'll have to come up with another way to piss them off." "Or you could just try and keep your head down and make it through the summer," Remus suggested, scraping the last of his ice cream up with his spoon. Sirius raised a sceptical eyebrow. Remus poked his tongue out in response, then proceeded to use said tongue to lick the spoon. Sirius looked away. There was a sudden shriek from down the table. The boys turned just in time to see Mary, who had also received a letter, burst abruptly into tears. The owl perched in front of her let out a very offended hoot and flapped away, clearly unsympathetic about its role as the bearer of bad news. "Mary!" Lily and Marlene exclaimed, shocked. "What's wrong?" Mary didn't answer, just shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. She pressed a hand to her mouth, and then without warning shoved back her chair, leaving the dining hall. Lily and Marlene only hesitated a moment before jumping up to follow her, appearing to be quite alarmed. "What do you think's up with her?" Peter asked, around a bite of food. Remus shrugged. He didn't look particularly concerned, unlike Mary's other friends. "Girl stuff." It was indeed, they discovered later, girl stuff, as Remus so eloquently put it. Lily filled them in that night when she came down to the common room to find her cardigan, or at least she filled Remus in, which was as good as telling all of them. "Darren dumped her," she whispered, voice grave. "She's a complete wreck, poor thing." "Right before the holidays?" Remus asked, frowning. "Bit harsh." "Yeah," Lily shook her head. "Said he couldn't be bothered waiting around while she was at school all year. Wants a girlfriend closer to home. I think she's well shot of him. He sounds horrible." "Bet Marlene's happy, though," Remus said, perking up a bit. "Won't have to hear about it anymore." "Don't bet on it," Lily warned grimly. "She hasn't shut up about how much she loved him yet." "Poor thing." Remus dug around in his pocket for a moment, pulling out a sugar quill. "Give her this. Tell her I hope she feels better, eh?" "Ah, you're so sweet, Remus," Lily simpered, leaning down to peck him on the cheek before she finally returned upstairs. Sirius rolled his eyes, frowning. "She wasn't that upset when she broke up with me," he muttered indignantly, moving a chess piece. "Well," Remus said evenly, returning back to their game. "She dumped you, didn't she? I expect it's different when you're the one getting dumped." "I wasn't that upset, then. I didn't think you and Mary were that serious," James put in, listening from where he was playing Exploding Snap with Peter on the rug. "You're only 13. 14, Sirius corrected. "But I take your point. Didn't really give it a fair go, did we?" "You weren't very mature about it," Peter sniffed, flipping through his pile of cards. Sirius felt a twinge of annoyance at the condescending tone. "No, well, no one ever caught us snogging in broom cupboards, you're right," he snapped. "Jealousy doesn't suit you, Black," Peter quipped dryly, which only annoyed Sirius more. He was opening his mouth to respond when Remus said pointedly, "Oi, you all promised me the snogging race was over." He frowned severely at all of them. "Don't knock it till you've tried it, Mooney," Peter said, returning back to his cards with a smug grin. Chapter 71, 4th Year, June. Saturday the 28th of June, 1975. The common room was chaos, exactly the way that Sirius liked it. As usual on the last day of term, everyone was frantically searching for misplaced objects, collecting abandoned books and trinkets that had been scattered about the room throughout the year, and calling out to each other so that clamouring voices rang out at every turn. "Have you seen my Accio wristwatch? Who took my toad? Has anyone seen my toad?" Sirius and James were crouched behind one of the oversized armchairs, each picking objects for the other to levitate. Sirius was just about to dare James to levitate Heartbreed's lucky quill. He had just discovered it, stuck between two sofa cushions, and was cradling it gently in his hands, when the portrait door swung open, and they were rudely interrupted. "You two!" huffed a familiar snippy voice. Sure enough, Evans marched over, wand brandished, and a very McGonagall-esque glare on her face. Sirius laughed and darted behind James, using him as a shield. "Oh, come on, Evans. Just a bit of last day high spirits. Why can't you just leave people be, Black? Why can't you just leave us be?" he shot back, sending green sparks flying up to singe the ceiling. "You're not a prefect yet, you know." "Oh, just you wait until I am." She stamped her foot, throwing a jinx at Sirius. Luckily, James was an excellent shield. He absorbed the spell quite nicely. Remus, who had walked in with Lily, was doing sod all to help, the traitor, began giggling hysterically as turnips sprouted from their poor friend's ears. "Well, that wasn't very goody-goody," Sirius admonished, taking the opportunity to transfigure a nearby lamp into a flock of birds that squawked and screeched and fluttered about the room. Lily wasn't finished, though. Before either of them could blink, she'd hit James with a jelly-legs drink, causing him to collapse to the floor, with his hand still clutching the turnips on his face. This left Sirius exposed to an attack, and before he could get his wand up, Lily had fired off a binding spell, disabling him. She turned to Remus. "Help me sort this out, will you?" "Oh, all right, yeah, fine." Remus grinned, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. Sirius watched, betrayed, from the floor, as Remus and Lily detransfigured the lamp, erased the single mark on the ceiling, and generally demolished all of the hard work, and generally dismantled all of the hard work that had gone into the common room, being such a wild state of anarchy. Sirius struggled against the invisible bonds, frustrated, but it was no use. Lily didn't even bother to lift her spells, only shot them an evil smirk before bidding a goodbye to Remus and disappearing up the stairs to the girls' dorm. "Isn't she marvellous?" James said wistfully, smiling as Remus helped him onto a nearby chair. His legs were still unsteady, shaking and threatening to give out beneath him. Just for such a goody two-shoes, Evans was certainly very good at jinxes. "Yeah, a real charmer," Sirius grumbled, offended that Remus had left him struggling on the ground. He wiggled again, trying to get free. "You two are just lucky she only uses her power for good," Remus tutted. "You'd be no match for her if she decided to go breaking the rules. Finite." He waved his wand over Sirius, finally undoing the binding spell. "Can't believe you helped her, Moony," he whined, trying to rub the feeling back into his arms. "Of course I did." Remus shrugged. "I'm terrified of her." His friends might have been willing to roll over for Lily Evans, but Sirius certainly was not. That night, after the others had fallen asleep, he snuck downstairs to set up the final prank. A bit of revenge, since Evans had curtailed their final day of mischief-making. His pockets were full of colour-changing capsules, rigged to explode once he said the correct spell. He planned to line them all up at the bottom of the staircase to the girls' dorm, then vanish them, so that he could set them off in the morning when Lily walked down the stairs. As long as he murmured the spell quietly, she'd have no way to prove it was him. Unfortunately, the common room wasn't empty. Sirius blinked, surprised to see that someone was crouched down in front of the fire. They had carriages to catch in just a few hours, and it hadn't crossed his mind that anyone else would be awake so late. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, squinting, and realised with a start that it was Mary. Her dark curls were haloed by the firelight, and she appeared to be burning something, tossing scraps of paper into the flames. Sirius turned, preparing to sneak back upstairs, and accidentally scuffed his shoe on the flagstones. The scrape sounded horribly clear in the silent room. Mary spun around. "Sirius? Hi, MacDonald. All right?" She sniffed, rubbing her face and turning back to the fire. "Couldn't sleep?" "Yeah, me neither," Sirius lied, standing awkwardly at the bottom of the stairs. Mary sniffed again, then sighed. He looked longingly at the stairs to the girls' dorms. Images of Evans's smug face covered in green and blue powder rapidly disappearing before his eyes. He padded over to crouch beside Mary on the carpet. It was strange, seeing her so vulnerable. Sirius didn't think he'd ever seen Mary cry. Not even at the nastiest insults that the Slytherins flung at her. She was always so upbeat, full of cheerful smiles and laughter. The things that bothered others rolled off Mary's back, or at least Sirius thought they did. "Darren's letters?" he asked casually, passing her another sheet of paper. She nodded, crumpling it up into a little ball and then chucking it into the fire. "Appalling handwriting," he tutted, shaking his head. "I think you've dodged a bullet, MacDonald. Must have had a headache trying to puzzle out this chicken scratch every time you wrote." "No one is as vain about their handwriting as you, Black," Mary snorted, shaking her head. Her lips quirked up a bit. "You told me you loved my handwriting." "Yeah, well, it's a bit frilly." Sirius scoffed, mock-offended. "My handwriting is incredibly manly. I'll have you know I am the peak of masculinity, some have said." "Oh, really?" "Really." "Who said?" "Effie Scunthorpe." Mary let out a startled laugh. "Effie Scunthorpe! That girl wrote the most ridiculous things in her little love letters. Remus got sick of her passing them to him in Ferox's class. That I about thought that he was ready to bite her head off by the end of term." She chuckled, pushing another piece of paper into the flames. "Made for some interesting reading, though." "You read them?" "Oh, we all did. Marlene and I thought they were hysterical." Sirius smiled grudgingly. "Yeah, they're all pretty stupid from what I remember. Glad somebody got a laugh out of it, I suppose." Mary smiled back at him, and for a moment they said nothing, content to sit in companionable silence. The fire crackled happily as Sirius helped her feed more paper into its hungry mouth. It was nice hanging out with Mary. She was kind and funny, and not afraid to speak her mind. They never really spent any time together alone, always surrounded by their respective friend groups, so Sirius was surprised by how comfortable he felt sitting next to her. "Do you want to sit with me on the train tomorrow?" he asked, on a whim. With us, I mean. Me and Remus, and James and Peter." Mary grinned, face still a bit puffy from crying. "Sure." Sunday, the 29th of June, 1975. Sirius was blurry-eyed in the morning, sticky with sleep. He woke to the familiar sensation of dread, a cold pit in his stomach as he thought about returning home. There was no ignoring it now. In just a matter of hours he'd be back on the steps of Grimmauld Place. He was quiet as the marauders finished their last-minute packing, heart twisting in his chest when he looked down at the ugly blast mark on his trunk. His mother would have a fit when she saw it. He was already cringing, imagining what she would say. If the others noticed his gloomy mood, they didn't comment on it. They all seemed to be giving him some space. James and Remus were discussing the final marks that had been posted, and Peter ran off at the first opportunity to find Desdemona. Sirius caught the worried glance that James kept darting in his direction, but the other boy didn't say anything until just before they were supposed to be boarding the carriages. McGonagall had just given them a 10-minute warning when James pulled Sirius aside, dragging him to the back of the empty dorm room. "What?" Sirius demanded, trying not to sound too irritated. He didn't like seeing the room without their things in it. It was too bare, stripped of all personality. It looked as though no one had ever lived in it at all. "Oh, come here," James insisted, pulling him towards an empty bed. "I have something for you." Sirius sat, as instructed, and waited while James dug around in his pockets. Finally, he withdrew a small compact mirror. It was lovely, silvery and etched with an ornate design. Sirius raised a brow. Is this about my vanity, Potter? I think we both know you're just No, James laughed. Just open it. Go on. Sirius sighed, snapping the compact open. Smooth skin reflected back at him, black hair and glasses. Glasses? With a start, Sirius realised that he was not seeing his own face, but his friend's. When he snapped his head up, James was holding an identical mirror in front of his head, grinning ear to ear. It's a family heirloom, he crowed eagerly, so that we can see each other any time. We don't have to bother writing letters. We can just use them. We can talk using them too. Sound travels and everything. Sure enough, there was a disconcerting echo of each word that James said coming from the tiny mirror. Sirius blinked, not sure of how to respond. There was such a sudden rush of affection, of love for his friend, brilliant and smiling, and always there, that he didn't know what to do with it. The sharp bite of loneliness that he had already begun to feel, thinking about the upcoming summer, was suddenly toothless, ostracized by the boy standing in front of him. Potter, James, this is... He paused to scrub at his eyes, which were prickling suspiciously. After a moment he looked back up. Thank you. This is the best thing that anyone's ever given me. James grinned, looking like he was about to say something back, but the door suddenly burst open. Remus stood in the hallway, glancing back and forth between them. Sorry, Moony, James said, getting to his feet. We're ready, eh, Black? Yeah, course, Sirius mumbled, still feeling slightly dazed as he stood. His heart was so full that he felt he might burst. Look what James gave me, he said to Remus, crossing the room and holding out the precious mirror. Remus stared down at it, looking confused. Very, pretty? James laughed. It's magic. It belonged to my granddad. Look. He opened the twin mirror, holding it up to his face. When Remus looked back down at the compact in his palm, his eyes widened. So that we can keep in touch over the summer, James explained. Oh my God, that's amazing. I know, James smiled, sliding his own mirror back into his pocket. Wish I could have gotten them for all of us. But they're an old family heirloom, and there's only 2. Sirius realised suddenly why James might have wanted to give him the mirror in private, and kicked himself mentally for making things awkward. He hadn't meant to make Moony feel left out or anything. He'd just been so excited. Oh, course, Remus said hurriedly, looking a bit embarrassed. There were a few tense seconds of silence before he cleared his throat. Come on. McGonagall's going to X us into next week if we miss the carriages. Fortunately, they did not miss the carriages. In fact, Sirius estimated that they had at least 30 seconds to spare, and pretty soon they were all piling on to their usual compartment on the train. It was decidedly more crowded than last year. In addition of the former orders, there were a number of new guests. Desdemona, of course, was wrapped around Peter, both of them cooing sickeningly at each other. Mary was there, too, since Sirius had invited her, and of course she had brought Marlene, which meant Lily had also come along. Otherwise she'd have to sit alone. Their trip was significantly noisier than usual, as a result. Peter and Desdemona fumbled with each other the entire ride, twisted up in a corner of the car. James tried everything he could think of to get Lily's attention, and when that failed, he switched to discussing Quidditch with Marlene. And Sirius, trying to cheer up Mary, graced his friends with a number of beautiful Beatles renditions. Mary had told him that Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was one of her favourite albums, and her delighted laughter made him feel very cool indeed. In fact, the only person who seemed to be sitting quietly was Remus, squashed next to Sirius's shoulder. When he turned to try and get the boy to join in for Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Sirius saw why. Tawny curls crushed against the window where he'd leaned his head, and Remus's eyes were shut fast, lips parted slightly. He had fallen asleep. Sirius turned back to Mary, who had also noticed Moony sleeping. The two of them exchanged a grin, and she held her finger to her lips, giggling. Picture yourself in a boat on a river, with tangerine trees and marmalade skies, Sirius half-sung, half-whispered, causing Mary to giggle even more. Somebody calls you, you answer quite slowly. A girl with kaleidoscope eyes. End of book 1.